Chrystia Freeland is a Liberal MP in Toronto. She has close ties with Ukraine, and she traveled to Kiev earlier this month to meet with officials in the interim government. Thank you for coming in to speak with us.
Great to be with you.
So what do you make of these developments now that Putin is acknowledging an independent Crimea? What do we do now?
Well, I think the actions that we've seen today from the EU, from the US, from Canada are important and are a step in the right direction. As you said in your intro, there are two really important things right now. The first is to send a very clear signal to Vladimir Putin and also to everybody in Russia that this action has been illegitimate, that the referendum is not internationally recognized, and that the new whatever it is of Crimea will not enjoy international legitimacy. That is significant. There is an experience of these sort of pseudo-states in the former Soviet Union, the Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and it's not a pretty picture. So it's important to send that message very clearly.
Aren't we doing that?
We are.
Okay.
And the second thing, which I think is the real focus going forward, is to understand that, this is going to be a long story. And our priority has to be to make very clear to Vladimir Putin that going any further will be a huge escalation and that there will be a response. And, William Hague, the British Foreign Secretary, has already said that he believes if Russian troops enter eastern and southern Ukraine, it will become a hot war. That is a terrifying prospect, and we have to do everything through diplomacy, through communicating clear steps to create some powerful disincentives for Russia to go further.
If this is going to be a long story, what role should Canada play in this narrative?
Well, I do want to say, I'm an opposition MP, but it's been very important to me and to us to not make this a partisan issue. This is an issue that is bigger than that. This is a huge issue for the world, and I think it's important for the world, for Ukraine, for Russia, to see Canadian politicians speaking with a united voice. And I think we are united in our belief that Ukraine and the idea of democracy and national sovereignty needs to be supported. So I'm, very pleased that Canada is stepping up. I'll tell you one thing. When I was in Kyiv earlier this month, I was struck really positively by how much people recognized what Canada was doing. They recognized the really good work of our embassy, and I'd like to have a shout out for them. It's really hard circumstances. They've moved the work of the embassy into the ambassador's own apartment. So they're working really hard, and lots of just people on the street, when they saw I was Canadian, said thank you very much. And symbols matter from Canada too. The fact that the Ukrainian flag flew on Parliament Hill, that was on Ukrainian TV many, many times. We were early in imposing sanctions and travel bans on key Ukrainian officials, which we're now seeing happen with Russia. So Canada sets a real moral example here, and that's important.
But, some Canadians might be wondering, what are we getting ourselves into here?
Well,
how far should Canada go in this, depending on what Putin does, right?
Absolutely. And I think that it is really important, and by the way, I think that there is large national consensus around what Canada has been doing so far. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a wide understanding among Canadians that this is a very powerful and very dangerous breach of international law. What Vladimir Putin has said is that he is free to invade sovereign countries. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very dangerous world in which Russia, a nuclear-armed state, feels able to do that. And I would add a further point. I think all of us, and Canada has been a big supporter of non-proliferation, the non-proliferation movement, of non-proliferation agreements. Something worth noting is that in 1994, Ukraine, which had nuclear weapons, gave them up. It was the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. And one reason that Ukraine did that was because there was something called the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed by the UK, the US, and Russia, guaranteeing Ukraine's borders. Now, what we've seen is that that memorandum, certainly by Russia, has been ignored. Think for a moment what that example says to other countries and what that does to the non-proliferation movement. So really, international law, our whole structure of living together in the world, is in jeopardy here. I think Canadians know that, and they care about that.
They do care about that, but how far do we go? You say it's going to be a long story, and yes, international laws have been broken. What situation is Canada in to get involved in this? I mean, are we going to send troops out there? I know you wrote about this recently, saying we need to reflect on the freedoms that we have right now based on what our ancestors fought for, and we need to look at what's happening here. That sounds like you think we should be in this for the long haul.
Well, I think being in it for the long haul means being very careful and mindful of diplomatic discussions that are happening and negotiations that are happening. And it's very important to not rule anything out, and also to not pre-commit to anything, because the reality is the ball right now is in Putin's court. We know for certain what the West needs to do, including Canada, is to support democratic Ukraine. The country, I think, has a lot of promising things going for it. This was a very powerful civil society, democratic uprising, and the people are excited about that. But their economy is in desperate trouble, and they've just been invaded. Imagine being in those circumstances. And so there's a lot we can do to help support and bolster and strengthen Ukraine, and to help Ukraine help itself. On the other issues, it really depends what Putin does. And I think right now, all of our efforts should be centered on discouraging Putin from going further. One final point that I think is really worth noting is we're seeing some very promising signs that the people in Russia don't want this. Putin's Russia has become a very authoritarian regime in which dissent is dangerous. Nonetheless, more than 50,000 people went out on the streets of Moscow over the weekend, many of them carrying Ukrainian flags, saying they don't want war. That is really significant, and it is important to note that this is Putin's action, but it really isn't the desire of the Russian people. And let's hope that he's able to see that.
All right, we have to leave it there. Thank you for coming in to speak with us.
Great to talk to you.
Chrystia Freeland is a Liberal MP in Toronto, joining us here in studio.